The desperate plea. The dark void of space stretched endlessly, broken only by the distant glow of dying stars. A lone starship drifted through the silence, its hull marked with battle scars. Inside the cockpit, Ethan Cross leaned back in his chair, staring at the blinking lights on his control panel. He was a man without a home, without a cause. Just another gun for hire, moving from one contract to the next. Then the distress signal came. It was weak, barely holding together, but the desperation in the voice made him sit up. "Please, someone, if you can hear this, help us." Ethan frowned, fingers tapping on the console. The voice belonged to a female. Alien. Her words were shaky, filled with fear. He ran a scan and located the source, a ruined planet nearby. Smoke still rising from its broken cities. "This is a bad idea," Ethan muttered to himself. But something in the woman's voice wouldn't let him ignore it. With a sigh, he gripped the controls and guided his ship toward the surface. The planet was in ruins. Buildings lay in shattered pieces, burned-out vehicles littered the roads, and the air smelled of smoke and death. Ethan moved carefully, his rifle in hand, his senses sharp. Then he saw her, a female Exinari, kneeling in the dirt. Her long, dark robes were torn, and her skin, pale blue with delicate patterns, was stained with dust and blood. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small, terrified child close to her chest. The girl's eyes were wide, her tiny fingers clutching her mother's robe. The woman looked up, eyes filled with tears. When she saw Ethan, she gasped, as if she couldn't believe he was real. "You're human," she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He studied the area, scanning for threats. "Who sent the distress call?" "I did," she said quickly. She stood up, still holding the child. "Please, you must help me." Ethan exhaled sharply. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't the kind of man people asked for help. "What happened here?" he asked. The woman's voice broke. "The Drizak Horde happened." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew that name well. The Drizak were ruthless slavers, feared across the galaxy. They raided colonies, capturing survivors and selling them to the highest bidder. "They took my sons," the woman continued. "My husband tried to fight them. They killed him." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. He had seen this story before. Innocence crushed under the boots of monsters. He had told himself he didn't care anymore. "Why me?" he asked. "There are other mercenaries." The woman shook her head. "The legends say humans fight without fear, that they never abandon those who call for help." Ethan almost laughed. Legends lie. Humans weren't fearless. They weren't noble warriors. At least, not all of them. But then he looked at the child. Her big, frightened eyes. Her tiny hands gripping her mother's robe like it was the only thing keeping her safe in this cruel world. Ethan sighed. Where did they take them? The woman's face filled with hope. A warship. It's still in orbit. Ethan frowned. If the ship was still there, it meant one thing. The Drizak were waiting for more survivors to capture. "We need to move," he said. "Now." Ethan led them through the ruins, staying in the shadows. He moved like a ghost, scanning for danger at every turn. The woman followed closely, holding her daughter tightly. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice low. "Tilina," she whispered. "And your daughter?" "Larry." Ethan glanced at the little girl. She was so quiet, eyes darting around in fear. She had probably seen things no child should ever see. A low hum filled the air. Ethan froze. A Drizak patrol ship hovered above the ruins, its searchlights scanning the ground. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. Ethan pressed Tilina and Larry against a broken wall. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The ship moved slowly, its spotlight sweeping over the wreckage. Ethan gripped his rifle, heart pounding. If they saw them, he'd have to fight, and he wasn't sure he could protect both of them. The light passed over their hiding spot. Ethan held his breath. Then, the ship moved on. Ethan let out a slow breath. "We need to get off this planet," he said. Talina nodded quickly. "You'll help me find my sons." Ethan looked at her, this desperate mother, clinging to the last hope she had. He wasn't sure why, but he found himself saying, "Yeah, I'll help you." Talina's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Ethan adjusted his rifle. The Drezak horde had no idea what was coming for them. The dangerous deal. The night sky above the ruined planet was filled with distant flashes, remnants of the battle that had already ended. The Drezak warship loomed overhead, its engines humming like a predator waiting for more prey. Ethan Cross watched it through the scope of his rifle, kneeling behind a broken wall. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get off this doomed planet, and never look back. But the woman standing beside him, Talina, had nowhere else to go. She was holding her daughter tightly, shielding the child from the cold night air. Her hands trembled, but not from the cold, from fear, from loss. "My sons are still on that ship," she whispered. Ethan lowered his rifle. "If they're alive, they're in the slave pens." Talina flinched at the word. Ethan had seen it before: crowded cells, children separated from their families, people beaten into obedience. The Drezak horde didn't just take prisoners. They broke them. "They'll be sold if we don't stop them," she said. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't a hero. He never had been. "What exactly do you want from me?" he asked. Talina looked at him, desperation burning in her violet eyes. "I need you to go up there and get them back." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Just me, against a warship full of slavers." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I have nothing left to give you but my thanks. But I've heard stories. Humans don't fear death." Ethan scoffed. "Whoever told you that is an idiot." Talina's lip trembled, but she held his gaze. "Please." Ethan hesitated. He didn't do rescue missions. He didn't fight for free. The last time he cared about someone, it had ended in fire and blood. He should say no. But then Lyri, the little girl, peeked up at him. She had been silent the whole time, but now her small voice broke through. "Are you strong?" she asked. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "My father was strong, but the bad men killed him." Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. "Are you strong too?" Ethan didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know anymore. The plan. 15 minutes later, Ethan knelt over a stolen Drezak holomap, studying the ship's layout. They had found the device in the ruins of a patrol post, one that Ethan had borrowed from a dead slaver. The warship was massive, built for long-haul raiding. Prisoner cells were located in the lower decks, surrounded by security turrets. The command center was at the top, guarded by elite warriors. "Getting inside isn't the problem," Ethan muttered. "Getting out is." Talina stood across from him, arms crossed. "How do we do it?" Ethan looked up at her. "We don't." "I do." Talina frowned. "I'm coming with you." Ethan shook his head. "You'll just slow me down." "I know my people," she argued. "I know how they think. And I won't leave without my sons." Ethan studied her for a moment. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in soldiers who refused to surrender, even when they were outnumbered. She wouldn't back down. "Fine," he said. "But if things go south, you follow my lead. No heroics." Talina nodded. Ethan exhaled. "What the hell am I doing? A dangerous gamble." They needed a way onto the ship. There was no sneaking in. Drezak vessels were locked down tight. The only way inside was through the front door. Ethan came up with a risky idea. They ambushed a small Drezak patrol unit, knocking them out before they could call for help. Ethan stole one of their helmets, fixing the voice modulator to sound like a real Drezak officer. He tied Talina's hands behind her back, loosely, so she could break free, and marched her toward the ship's landing bay, pretending to be a bounty hunter delivering the new slave. Talina stiffened. I come like this." "Neither do I," Ethan muttered. "But it's the only way." They approached the landing platform, where two Drizak guards stood with their rifles ready. Their reptilian eyes scanned Ethan as he pushed Tilena forward. "I have a survivor," Ethan growled, mimicking their guttural speech. "One of the colony's leaders. High value." The guards tilted their heads. "Why is she not in a cage?" Ethan's fingers twitched near his hidden knife. "Because I wanted the bounty myself." The guards exchanged glances. Ethan could tell they were suspicious. One wrong move, and this whole plan would fall apart. One of them finally grunted. "Take her inside. Commander Voss will decide her fate." Ethan fought the urge to sigh in relief. Step 1. Complete. The warship. The moment they stepped inside, Ethan felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. The Drizak horde was made up of different species, tall, muscular warriors with scaly skin and sharp teeth, wearing blood-red armor. They prowled through the ship's corridors, snarling orders, and dragging prisoners toward the lower decks. Ethan kept his grip on Tilena's shoulder, forcing himself to walk like he belonged. They passed a holding area, where aliens of all species were packed into metal cages. The air was thick with the stench of fear. Ethan clenched his jaw. Tilena's breathing was ragged, but she kept walking. Then, Mama. Tilena's head snapped toward one of the cages. A young Xenari boy with dark eyes and a bruised face pressed against the bars, reaching for her. Beside him, an older boy, his brother, held his arm protectively. Tilena gasped. "My sons." The guards turned instantly. Suspicion flickered across their reptilian faces. Ethan knew the deception wouldn't last much longer. Time to act. In one swift motion, Ethan pulled his rifle from his back and fired. The first guard collapsed instantly, his chest armor bursting apart. Alarms blared. Tilena broke free, spinning around and snatching a weapon from the fallen guard. Her hands shook, but she stood her ground. The horde warriors roared, drawing their blades. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the boys in the cage. "Get down." The fight had begun. A deadly infiltration. The moment Ethan fired his rifle, chaos erupted. Drizak warriors spun toward the sound, their scaly hands reaching for weapons. The warship's alarms screamed through the corridors, red warning lights flashing overhead. The air was thick with the smell of oil, metal, and burning plasma. Tilena, now free, grabbed the fallen guard's rifle with shaky hands. She barely knew how to use it, but she held it tight, her eyes locked on her sons, who were still trapped behind the energy bars of the cage. "Stay down," Ethan barked. The first Drizak warrior lunged, a massive brute with jagged armor and glowing red eyes. Ethan sidestepped at the last second, slamming the butt of his rifle into the alien's skull. The creature stumbled, but another came from behind, slashing with a curved blade. Ethan twisted, dodging the blade by inches before delivering a brutal shot to the gut. The warrior collapsed with a gurgled snarl. Tilena raised her stolen rifle, her breathing rapid. She aimed at a charging guard but froze, her hands shaking too much to pull the trigger. The Drizak warrior snarled, lifting his massive rifle to fire. Ethan shot first. The alien collapsed, and Ethan turned to Tilena, grabbing her by the arm. "If you freeze, we die. Keep moving." She swallowed hard and nodded. The boys were still trapped in the cage, their small hands gripping the bars. Their terrified eyes darted between their mother and the chaos around them. "Hold on," Ethan called to them. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and rushed to the control panel beside the cages. His fingers flew over the controls, but the emergency lockdown had already activated. Damn it. The doors wouldn't open from here. A heavy thud shook the hallway. Ethan turned just in time to see a squad of Drizak enforcers marching toward them. These weren't the same low-level slavers from before. These were elites, covered in thick armor, their weapons glowing with high-energy plasma rounds. One of them, A Drezak commander stepped forward. His armor was darker than the others, and deep scars ran across his reptilian face. His red eyes locked onto Ethan. "You dare challenge the Horde?" the commander growled. His voice was deep, like grinding stone. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle. "Not challenge. Just kill." The commander grinned, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Brave words for a dead man. He raised his weapon. Ethan grabbed Tilina and dove behind a fallen crate as plasma shots rained down. The heat from the blasts scorched the walls, leaving deep smoking holes in the metal. "We're trapped," Tilina gasped. Ethan glanced at the boys. The older one, barely 10 years old, clutched his younger brother protectively. Their faces were pale with fear. "I have to get them out. Now." He scanned the room, searching for anything that could turn the fight. Then he saw it, a fuel canister near the far wall. It was marked with a warning symbol, highly explosive. Ethan smirked. "That'll do." He whistled sharply, catching the commander's attention. "Hey, scales for brains." The commander snarled and raised his rifle. Ethan fired first, right at the canister. The explosion ripped through the hall, sending Drezak warriors flying. The shockwave shattered the nearby security terminal, and the cage bars flickered and collapsed. The boys were free. Tilina ran forward, scooping them into her arms. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered their names, holding them tight. Ethan didn't get a chance to enjoy the moment. The Drezak commander was still alive. His armor was scorched, and blood dripped from his forehead, but he stood, rage burning in his glowing eyes. "You'll pay for that," he growled. Ethan raised his rifle, only to hear the dreaded click of an empty chamber. The commander charged. Ethan barely had time to react before the Drezak's massive fist slammed into his chest, sending him crashing into the metal wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. The commander grabbed Ethan by the throat and lifted him off the ground. "Humans think they are strong," the Drezak sneered, "but we break strong things." Ethan struggled against the vice-like grip, his vision blurring from lack of air. He reached for his knife. A gunshot rang out. The commander staggered back, a burning hole in his skull. Tilina stood behind him, her hands still shaking from the shot. The rifle slipped from her grip, and she stared at the body in shock. Ethan coughed, rubbing his throat. "Not bad." She blinked at him, still shaken. I killed him." Ethan pulled himself up, groaning. "That's the general idea." She took a shaky breath, holding her sons close. Then the ship's speakers crackled to life. A deep, guttural voice filled the warship. "All units, lock down the ship. Intruders detected. Kill them on sight." Ethan sighed. "Well, that's not good." Red blast doors slammed shut across the hallways. The air hissed with depressurization, and the lights flickered as the ship's systems went into full lockdown. Tilina clutched her children. "What do we do now?" Ethan glanced at the smoke-filled corridor, then back at her. "We finish what we started." His voice was calm, but deep inside, he knew. The real fight had just begun. The first battle. The red emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the warship's metal corridors. The alarms screamed, a never-ending wail of chaos and death. Ethan Cross took a slow breath, steadying his grip on his rifle. The air smelled of burning metal and plasma. Behind him, Tilina clutched her sons, shielding them with her body. The warship was in full lockdown. Drezak warriors were coming. Ethan checked his ammo. Half a clip left. Not enough. He glanced at the fallen guards, their bodies sprawled across the floor. He grabbed a plasma pistol from one of their belts, tucked it into his holster, and turned to Tilina. "Stay behind me," he said. Tilina nodded, her face pale. The boys clung to her, their wide eyes filled with fear. Then the sound of heavy boots filled the corridor. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his rifle raised. A squad of Drezak enforcers stormed into view, their armor gleaming under the red lights. They were bigger, stronger, and armed to the teeth. Their leader, a hulking brute with a scared face, stopped in front of the fallen commander's body. He stared at the corpse for a moment, then turned his glowing red eyes toward Ethan. "You killed Commander Voss," the brute growled. His voice was like grinding stone. Ethan shrugged. He started it. The brute roared, raising a massive plasma cannon. Ethan dived left just as the hallway exploded in a rain of molten metal. The heat seared his face as he rolled behind a crate, returning fire. Tilena and the boys ducked low, pressing against the wall. The battle erupted. The Drizak warriors fired plasma bolts, melting the walls with every blast. Ethan moved fast, dodging, shooting, reloading. He aimed for weak points, throats, joints, eyes. The first Drizak warrior fell with a gurgling snarl. Another charged at him, swinging a massive serrated blade. Ethan dodged, barely, but the blade sliced across his arm, drawing blood. He gritted his teeth and jammed his plasma pistol under the alien's chin. One shot. The warrior collapsed. Tilena grabbed a fallen weapon, aimed at a charging slaver, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard, but her shot was dead on. The enemy stumbled, smoke rising from his chest. Tilena gasped, staring at the weapon in her hands. Ethan didn't stop. He grabbed a grenade from a fallen soldier's belt, pulled the pin with his teeth, and tossed it down the hall. "Cover your ears," he warned. Boom. The explosion ripped through the corridor, sending Drizak bodies flying. Silence followed. Smoke curled through the air. Ethan exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. He turned to Tilena. "You okay?" She nodded, her face still pale. She looked at the rifle in her hands, then at Ethan. I never killed before." Ethan studied her. "You just saved your sons." She swallowed hard, then nodded. The boys peeked up from behind their mother. Their older son, Jalek, stared at Ethan with something new in his eyes. Not fear, admiration. "You fight like the old warriors in the stories," Jalek whispered. Ethan shook his head. "I fight to survive." Then, the ship shook violently. The lights flickered, and a deep, booming voice filled the halls. "Intruders, you have made a grave mistake." The voice was deep, filled with unshakable authority. Tilena's face went pale. "That's the ship's warlord." Ethan exhaled. "Great, just what I needed." Then, massive steel doors slammed shut behind them. They were trapped. The warship's heart. Ethan led the group forward, deeper into the warship. Every step echoed in the silence. The air was thick with smoke and tension. "We can't stay here," Ethan muttered. "The hangar bay is this way," Tilena whispered, pointing down a dark corridor. Ethan nodded and moved ahead, scanning every corner. The warship had shifted tactics. They weren't rushing anymore. They were waiting, hunting. Then, clang, a distant sound. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Ethan froze, pressing his back to the wall. He gestured for Tilena and the boys to stay low. The footsteps grew louder. Then he saw it. A massive Drizak warlord, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark armor, walked into view. His reptilian face was marked with scars, and his eyes burned with cold fury. Ethan had seen monsters before. This one was different. This one was calm. Controlled. The warlord tilted his head, studying Ethan. Then he spoke. "Human," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You fight well. I see why the legends speak of your kind." Ethan didn't reply. He tightened his grip on his rifle. The warlord smiled, revealing razor-sharp teeth. "But you are outnumbered, outgunned. You have no escape." Ethan smirked. "Escape? I was never planning to run." The warlord laughed, a dark, rumbling sound. "Then you are a fool." He raised his massive war blade. Ethan raised his rifle. Tension hung in the air. The warlord's eyes gleamed with confidence. "You will fall." Ethan grinned. "Try me." Then, the battle truly began. The horrific truth. The air inside the warship was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Ethan Cross faced the Drezak warlord, his grip tight on his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. Across from him, the massive reptilian brute stood motionless, holding a warblade the size of a human torso. The warlord's red eyes glowed like embers, locked onto Ethan with a predatory hunger. Tilina's eyes widened. But the prisoners. Ethan cracked his knuckles, blood dripping from his busted lip. "Then we free them first." A desperate plan. Ethan turned back to the control panel. If they were going to take this ship down, they needed a way to unlock the prison cells, a path to the reactor core, an escape route. Tilina's fingers flew across the controls. One by one, cell doors began unlocking. Ethan grabbed his rifle. Time to start a riot. The corridors of the warship suddenly erupted with sound. From deep within the ship, prisoners, hundreds of them, were now free. And they were angry. The Drezak slavers turned in shock as former captives grabbed weapons, pipes, whatever they could find, and charged. The battle spread like wildfire. Ethan grinned. "Now we bring this place down." The final push. As the battle raged around them, Ethan and Tilina fought their way toward the reactor core. Explosions rocked the ship. Drezak warriors fell under the fury of their former captives. And Ethan knew this warship wasn't going to survive the night. But neither would they, unless they moved fast. Selena clutched her sons close. "Ethan, how do we get out?" Ethan reloaded his rifle, eyes locked on the reactor ahead. "We run." And then, the warship's final defenses activated. The final escape. The warship trembled as explosions ripped through its core. The once mighty Drezak vessel was dying, and everyone on board knew it. Ethan Cross, Tilina, and her sons sprinted through the fire-lit corridors, dodging falling debris and enemy fire. Behind them, a full-scale rebellion had erupted. Hundreds of freed prisoners, fueled by rage and desperation, fought back against their former captors. The once dominant Drezak warriors, caught off guard by the unexpected uprising, struggled to maintain control. Weapons clashed, blasters fired, bodies fell. The warship's alarm system screamed in protest, warning of catastrophic failure. Ethan led the way, his rifle almost empty, his body covered in sweat and blood. His ribs ached from the earlier fight with the warlord, but he pushed forward. "We have to get to the hangar bay," he yelled over the chaos. Tilina ran beside him, her two sons gripping her hands tightly. Jalek, the older boy, kept looking over his shoulder. "Are we going to make it?" he asked, breathless. Ethan didn't lie. "I don't know, kid, but we're gonna try." Then, a blast door slammed shut in front of them, cutting off their path. Tilina gasped. "No, we need that corridor." Ethan cursed under his breath. The ship's automated lockdown was still in effect. The Drezak might have been losing the battle, but their warship's defenses were still working just fine. Ethan quickly scanned the corridor. There, a maintenance hatch, slightly open. "This way," he ordered. He pushed open the hatch and dropped down into the maintenance tunnels below the main corridors. Tilina helped her boys through before following. The tunnels were tight, dark, and full of smoke. The air was thick with the scent of scorched wires and leaking fuel. "This leads to the engine bay," Ethan explained. "We cut through, get to the emergency pods and—" A loud metallic snarl echoed through the tunnel. Ethan froze. Tilina clutched her sons tighter. What was that? From the darkness ahead, something moved. Then they saw them. Drezak war beasts. A new nightmare. The Drezak horde didn't just use soldiers. They bred monsters. The war beasts were 7 feet tall, their muscular, quadrupedal bodies covered in thick armored plating. Their yellow eyes glowed like molten gold, and their elongated jaws were filled with razor-sharp teeth. They had been released. The Drezek knew their ship was failing. They didn't care about winning anymore. Now they just wanted to kill as many prisoners as possible before the ship collapsed. One of the beasts sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. Then, its gaze locked onto them. Ethan didn't wait. Bang, bang, bang. He fired 3 quick shots. The first ricocheted off the beast's armor. The second dug into its shoulder, but barely slowed it down. The third just made it angry. With a thunderous roar, the war beast charged. "Move," Ethan yelled. Thelina grabbed her sons and ran. Ethan pulled a flash grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and tossed it behind them. Boom! The blinding white light erupted in the tunnel, forcing the war beasts to howl in agony as their sensitive eyes were overloaded. It gave them just enough time to reach the engine bay. The heart of the beast. The engine bay was chaos. Pipes burst, steam shot out of cracks in the walls, and the reactor core itself, a massive spinning orb of raw energy, was unstable. The ship was seconds away from destruction. The freed prisoners had made it here too. They were fighting their way toward the emergency escape pods, desperately trying to survive. Ethan grabbed a fallen Drezek's wrist console, quickly scanning for the ship's self-destruct controls. "What are you doing?" Thelina asked. "Making sure they never do this again." With a few quick commands, Ethan bypassed the reactor's failsafe. The ship wouldn't just collapse. It was going to explode. "Now we run," he muttered. He turned, just in time to see a Drezek execution squad step into the engine bay. He recognized the leader instantly. High Commander Scaris. Unlike the warlord Ethan had fought earlier, Scaris was different. He was calm, focused, deadly. "Human," Scaris said, his voice deep and cold. "You have done the impossible. You have defied the Horde." Ethan raised his rifle. "And I'm not done yet." Scaris didn't flinch. "No, you are." Then, the Drezek fired. The final stand. The battle was a blur of light and death. Ethan dove behind a burning console as plasma fire tore through the air. Prisoners fought back fiercely, their desperation turning them into warriors. Thelina and her sons were trapped behind a fallen support beam, unable to move. Ethan knew what had to happen. He had to buy them time. He charged into the open, firing his last rounds into the advancing Drezek warriors. 2 fell, one with a hole in his skull, the other collapsing with a seared chest wound. Scaris didn't move. The High Commander simply raised his hand, and his soldiers stopped. "You are a warrior, Cross," Scaris said, tilting his head. "But this is where your story ends." Ethan smirked, his gun now empty. "Not yet." Then, he hit the final override switch. The reactor core screamed, a deep, earth-shaking howl of raw energy. The ship was about to detonate. Scaris's eyes widened. "You fool." Ethan grinned. "I know." He turned, grabbing Thelina's arm. "Go. Now." The escape pods were in sight. The freed prisoners ran, pushing forward, leaping into the pods. Thelina and her sons made it inside. Ethan was right behind them, when a plasma bolt tore through his side. Pain exploded through his ribs. He staggered, blood pouring from the wound. Thelina screamed, "Ethan!" But he still moved. He grabbed the escape pod controls, slamming his fist down. The doors closed. Thelina's face pressed against the glass, horror in her eyes. Ethan smiled weakly. The last thing he saw was the escape pods launching into space, just as the warship erupted into fire. Humanity's fury. The Drezek warship exploded like a dying star, a fireball tearing through the void. The shockwave sent debris scattering into the abyss, burning remnants of a vessel that had once been a symbol of terror. Inside an escape pod, Thelina clutched her sons, her heart hammering against her ribs. The force of their sudden launch pressed them back against the seats. Through the viewport, She saw the warship break apart, flames consuming its monstrous frame. But her eyes weren't on the destruction. They were on Ethan Cross. He wasn't in the pod. He was still on the warship. "No," she whispered. Her breathing became ragged. "No, no, no." Jalek, her eldest son, grabbed her hand. "Mama, where is he?" Talina couldn't answer. Her throat locked up, her mind racing. Ethan had saved them. He had stayed behind. And now he was gone. A sharp beep filled the pod. A proximity alert. Talina's head snapped up. A small figure tumbled through space, drifting just ahead of the explosion. Her breath caught. Ethan. A dead man drifting. Ethan floated through the cold abyss, his body limp, his mind fading. He barely felt the searing pain in his side where the plasma shot had torn through him. His oxygen was running low, his vision blurred. So this is how it ends. For a moment, he let go. The stars stretched endlessly, and his memories came in flashes. A battlefield on a distant planet, smoke rising over the dead. A woman's voice, soft, calling his name. A memory long buried. A promise he had once made to never fight for anything again. Yet, here he was, fighting, bleeding, dying. Then, something grabbed his arm. A mechanical claw extended from an escape pod, latching onto his suit. The sudden pull jolted him, snapping him out of the darkness creeping into his mind. He barely registered the pod opening, hands pulling him inside. Warm air hit his face, and then, pain. His body screamed as his mind forced itself back into reality. Ethan. The voice was distant at first, then closer, frantic. He opened his heavy eyelids and saw Talina's face above him, her violet eyes filled with desperation and relief. "You idiot," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she pressed against the wound on his side, trying to slow the bleeding. Ethan chuckled weakly. Didn't plan on dying today. Jalek and his younger brother stared at him, wide-eyed. "You came back," Jalek whispered. Ethan groaned, shifting painfully. "Not by choice, kid. Space is cold." The pod rocked violently, pulling them away from the wreckage of the warship. The automated systems engaged, charting a course toward the nearest habitable world. Talina exhaled sharply, pressing her forehead against Ethan's chest, overwhelmed with exhaustion. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe. They were free. The aftermath. The escape pod descended onto a green, uncharted moon, its entry leaving a streak of fire in the sky. The landing was rough. Metal screeched against the earth, but the pod held together. Ethan barely registered the impact. His body was numb, his mind flickering between consciousness and blackness. Talina and her sons dragged him out, pulling him onto the soft grass beneath an alien sky. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air wasn't filled with the stench of war, blood, or burning metal. Just wind, trees, a distant river. Silence. Ethan groaned. "Didn't think I'd wake up again." Talina knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his chest to keep him from moving. "You need rest." Ethan smirked, even as pain flared through his ribs. "Rest is for the dead." "You almost were." Her voice was softer now, but still firm. She turned to Jalek. "Help me get him to shelter." The boy nodded without hesitation. As they moved Ethan toward the cover of the trees, he caught sight of something on the horizon. A distant city. Talina saw it too. A colony. Ethan exhaled. "Good. We can get supplies. Maybe find a way off this rock." Talina hesitated. And then, Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the blue sky, at the peaceful world they had landed on. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from a war, a contract, or his past. For the first time, he had fought for someone other than himself. Finally, he smirked. "We see where the road takes us." Talina studied him for a moment. Then she smiled, just a little. "Wherever it takes us," she said, "you won't go alone." Ethan chuckled, closing his eyes as exhaustion took him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Epilogue. The legend begins. Weeks later, news spread across the outer colonies. A Drezak warship, one of their most feared slaver vessels, had been destroyed. A human mercenary and Exenary widow had led a rebellion, freeing hundreds of captives. Rumors whispered of a man who fought without fear, a man who defied the Drezak horde and lived. A legend began to grow, and deep in the shadows of the galaxy, the Drezak were listening. In the darkness of a distant warship, High Commander Scaris stood before a hologram of his Drezak overlords. His wounds had healed, his hatred had not. The humans survived, one of the Drezak leaders growled. Scaris's jaw tightened. Yes, he admitted, but I will correct that mistake. The Drezak overlord leaned forward, his reptilian eyes glowing. Then hunt him down. Scaris smirked. With pleasure.